Almost a third of New Zealanders like the idea of an authoritarian leader who doesn't have to worry about parliament or elections. That's the new finding of a report into social cohesion published by the Helen Clark Foundation. Shamobeel Jacob has led the research and is with us this morning. Kia ora, good morning.
Kia ora.
Why does social cohesion matter?
It matters because the glue that holds us together, it helps us able to have difficult conversations and reach decisions. I heard Bish talk before about how we're always going to have politics, but how do we, despite the politics, have the right things happen for the long term of New Zealand?
And if the opposite of social cohesion is polarisation, it's something we're seeing a lot in democracies around the world at the moment.
Absolutely, and I think that was really the motivation behind this, is if we're going to see increasing polarization, we're going to see more volatile politics, less certainty around policies, and that means business, community and life becomes unpredictable. And our democracy, which is the bedrock of how we run this place, comes under pressure.
So we've gone through the report and I've isolated a few different areas for us to focus on in a couple of minutes. But first of all, as part of this report, you compared New Zealand with Australia across 5 different dimensions of social cohesion. So broadly speaking, how did we compare?
We sucked. We were worse on every single dimension, and I did not expect that. When I started the survey, I truly hoped that we would be better on at least some things. But we were behind on everything. And the frightening thing for me was so much of it was linked around poverty, around political alliances, around ethnicity. There are these fractures within our society that are much more widespread than they're in Australia.
Interesting. All right, we're going to compare New Zealand's numbers with Australia in a couple of minutes. So I want to talk about democracy first of all. 81% of respondents in your survey said that democracy is good for running the country. But when you frame the question a slightly different way, it had a fascinating response. Have a look at this. You asked, would having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections be a good way to govern New Zealand? 32% of people said it would be a good way to govern New Zealand. But here's the thing, 48% of men under the age of 44 think it would be good. What do you put that down to?
Well, it is that anger, that feeling that our democracy and our political system doesn't represent everybody's views. And we've seen this not just amongst young men, particularly Pākehā men, we've also seen it actually quite a big rise amongst our Asian population. So there is this extraordinary fracturing, and I think people really don't see that their interests and their values are being represented.
So how do we fix that?
Well, it's really hard. And I think that was the reason why I wanted to do this is, first, is there a fracture? And if there is, how do we understand where these people are coming from? Because it's not good enough to say, what's happening in America is not going to happen here. Because that's exactly what we see in the data, is that the same kind of anger is showing up in New Zealand. And we can't bury our head and just say it's going to go away. I think we need to grapple with it and go, why is it happening? And I think understanding would be the first step.
So what do you make for the disconnect between those numbers? So say if you flip the 81% of respondents saying democracy is good, you flip that around and say, well, 19% of people didn't say that democracy is good. That's still a 10 or 13% difference with the number of respondents
Absolutely.
who said that having an authoritarian leader would be good. Do people just not understand what democracy is?
I think so. I think there's a real sense of complacency around how precious and how valuable democracy is. And if you look at the survey, that inconsistency and incoherence in people's answers, I think is absolutely evidence that people's understanding of democracy is not very strong. So we kind of talk about democracy, but what does it actually mean? And is it actually giving expression to our values? I think there is a disconnect there.
All right, I'm going to share the next survey results. You asked, how often do you think the government in Wellington can be trusted to do the right thing for the New Zealand people? So 42% said always or mostly, 52% said sometimes or never. How critical is this result when it comes to the trust in democracy?
Well, it's extraordinarily critical. If we can't trust the leaders who are there to represent us, how can we have faith in our institutions? And I think therein lies the challenge. And within this, we saw some big divergences within communities. Maori and Pacifica in particular were much more negative around this view. So we're seeing this erosion of trust with particular communities, particular parts, particularly poor people really don't feel like they can trust their leaders. So it feels like there is this kind of lack of connection into our communities. Our leaders are not truly representing our wider community.
And that, once again, feels like a very tricky problem to solve.
None of these problems are easy. And that's fine, but it's a problem that we need to deal with, because despite the problems, despite the divergences, what we do see is New Zealanders well and truly believe in the idea of New Zealand and the idea of democracy. But that idea might be a bit disconnected, a bit disjointed. We still have time.
Okay, I want to share these numbers because I think for me these stood out more than almost anything else when we're comparing New Zealand's results with Australia. So you asked are immigrants good for the economy? 56% of people in New Zealand said yes, they agreed. 11 disagreed. In Australia, 82% of people agreed. Immigrants improve society. In New Zealand, 50% of people agreed. In Australia, 82% of people agreed. And immigrants make good citizens. In New Zealand, you had 51% of people agreed. In Australia, 92% of people agreed. How do you account for that divergence?
I can't. I can't because we've run very similar policies over a long period of time. Immigration's always been the easy safety valve for our governments to grow the economy when everything else failed. It was the cheap shot to the economy. And I think what we're seeing is New Zealanders saying, we're not comfortable with that anymore. And this is a real concern because I think our politicians are still talking about immigration as if it's this technocratic rule that we pull on the other side from Wellington and everything will be fine. But it's clear that that is not the case.
Is that because people aren't associating migration with better economic conditions?
And rightly so. I think over the course of the last decade, we've had an extraordinary amount of population growth, but we haven't seen productivity growth. We haven't seen per capita growth in the same way. So if we have economic growth that's about volumes rather than lifting everybody up, how is that going to be seen by the citizens? And I think that's what we're seeing. There's a sense that our jobs are being stolen. Our economic growth is not really growing. It's crowded. We don't have enough homes. Why are we growing our population if we can't get the basics right?
So how should a government take those kind of results and apply those to immigration policy?
I think with immigration policy, we need to be very consistent rather than the stop-start. You know, when immigration's high, we don't like immigrants. When immigration's low, why doesn't anybody love us? We need to go to something much more consistent and go, we have immigration for these reasons, and we're going to fill it with a quota of X many thousand per year. I think we've got to be consistent.
You also asked about the relationship with Indigenous peoples, both here in New Zealand and in Australia. So the relationship between Māori and the wider New Zealand community is very important for New Zealand, and 70% of people agreed. This really surprised me. In Australia, 85% of people agreed. What do you make of that?
I think people tell a lot of fibs in surveys sometimes. So I really don't think Indigenous relations in New Zealand are far worse than in Australia. I think we're going through a much more courageous conversation, very difficult conversation, but I don't think that's true in Australia. So yes, I think people may say things, but the actions in New Zealand I think are far more constructive, dangerous and still scary, but I think far more constructive than what's happening in Australia.
So how do you think about that result in the context of the treaty principles debate?
Well, I think what it shows is that in New Zealand, we've seen that erosion, that people understand that there is a value to the Indigenous community in New Zealand and those things are important, but there is a gap that's opened up over the course of recent years, and I think the Treaty Principles Bill has brought out a lot of people from the woodworks who would otherwise not have opposed these kinds of things.
But that being said, you described it as perhaps a more courageous position at the moment because New Zealand is having this debate.
Well, I think we have to have these confrontations, and we can't just constantly avoid having difficult conversations. And I think the problems that we face in a society are because we choose not to grapple with the issues. And when it comes to the relationship with our Indigenous population, it is a difficult conversation that we must have. Are we doing it the right way? Probably not. Is there a better way? Possibly. But is it better that we have it than not have it? Absolutely.
See, that's so interesting. You think that it's really important to have confrontations. Most people would say that having confrontations flies in the face of social cohesion.
No, and social cohesion is not about being the same. We are not about assimilation. Social cohesion is about being able to have difficult conversations and still have a beer afterwards. We have to be able to have difficult conversations, listen to each other, and understand where the other person is coming from. We can converse without converting.
That is so interesting, but I suppose it's the mechanism, it's the framework through which you have these conversations that is vital to cohesion.
That's right. If we come with humility and with genuine curiosity about each other's views, then the conversation is good and positive, and we can still walk away with different views, but at least we have understood where the other person comes from.
Okay, I've got one more survey result that I want to share, and this speaks to many of the dynamics that I think probably underpin some of the other results. How satisfied are you with your present financial situation? 32% of New Zealanders said they were satisfied. Australia, of course, deserved much stronger results. To what extent does this number influence all of these other measures?
A great deal. So poverty is one of the biggest markers of divergences of views, that erosion of social cohesion is related firstly with poverty. So those people who are not doing well are really suffering. Not only do we have only a third of New Zealanders that say they're doing well, a quarter of New Zealanders miss meals sometimes.
Yeah, that's huge.
A quarter is shocking. It's twice as high as in Australia. So I think we do have a real problem with poverty in New Zealand, and poverty strips away at people's dignity and their ability to connect with their communities and society. And we have to be able to get on top of this. We have the resources in this country to be able to deal with this stuff, only if we choose to.
What groups give you most cause for concern when it comes to economic measures?
Young people, Maori and Pacifica, and very much the people who are kind of at the margins of society. What we see also, young men, Pākehā men in particular, feel very aggrieved about a whole bunch of different things. So we're seeing these fractures across different dimensions, across different parts of society, rather than going, it's all Maori, or it's all Pacifica, or it's all young white men. What we're seeing is that our society has become very stratified across different things. And that makes it hard because you can't stereotype and go, just because you're Asian, you're going to have this particular view. Within the Asian community, we're seeing these massive divergences. And therein lies the challenge. We apply the stereotypes at our peril.
Yeah, it's interesting that when you look at those different demographic measures, for want of a better term, the age is one. So to take that economic measure, only 25% of people under the age of 30 say that they're satisfied with their economic position. Compare that with over 60s, 44% of people say they're satisfied with their economic conditions. How do you fix something like that?
Well, some of the fixes are really easy. Don't make welfare so bad for young people, but so good for old people. So, we know that New Zealand Super, which is also welfare, is hell of a lot higher than job seeker benefits. Why is it that if you're old, you get to be, compensated with a lot more money than somebody who's young and who's got their whole life ahead of them?
What's good about these results?
What's good about this result? I think what's good about this result is, first, there is an incredible passion and love for New Zealand that absolutely comes through. People really, truly believe in the idea of New Zealand and the culture and the values of New Zealand. Over 80% of New Zealanders. That is super positive. But what really scares me is that I think it's under attack.
What sort of measures do you think we can take in the short term then to ward off that attack, to foster greater social cohesion?
I think there's two things. I think leadership and political process. I think our political processes need to have much more constructive conversations around how we work together. The conversation you had with Bish before, where he talked about where we want to try and find areas of common interest. That is exactly the kinds of things we want to see, more common areas of interest. But there's also some things we can do individually, and I think there's three things for me. The first is just awareness that this is an issue in New Zealand, that we are not really a cohesive society, that there are pressures, there are some groups that are really doing it tough. Asking ourselves, do I have stereotypes that are wrong? Because we all do it. It's a mental model that we use. And the third thing is, when you're having a conversation, will you ask a question with true curiosity rather than impose your views? Will you converse, or will you try to convert?
Shamubeel Jacob, thank you so much for your time. That study has been published by the Helen Clark Foundation.